Ray Dalio realized the American dream was ending when Jerome Powell's hands started shaking during the most classified Federal Reserve meeting in modern history. It wasn't the tremor that shocked him. It was what Powell had just revealed about the true state of American debt that made Ray's blood run cold. "Gentlemen, what I'm about to show you cannot leave this room," Powell said, his voice barely above a whisper as he activated the secure presentation system. The date was March 15, 2026, and Ray had been summoned to an emergency session that officially didn't exist. No minutes would be taken, no recordings made. This was the kind of meeting that happened when empires were about to fall. Ray glanced around the mahogany table at the other attendees. Janet Yellen sat rigid, her usual composed demeanor replaced by visible distress. Treasury Secretary nominees shuffled papers nervously. The room's atmosphere felt like a funeral, which Ray was beginning to realize it essentially was. Powell clicked to the first slide, and Ray's decades of economic experience couldn't prepare him for what he saw. The numbers glowing on the screen represented the financial equivalent of a terminal cancer diagnosis for the United States of America. As of yesterday, our national debt has reached $38.7 trillion, Powell announced. That represents 127% of our GDP. But that's not the real problem. He paused, letting the weight of that statement sink in. The real problem is what happens next. Ray leaned forward, his analytical mind racing through the implications. He'd been warning about unsustainable debt cycles for years, but seeing the actual figures in this stark presentation format made the crisis feel immediate and terrifying. Powell clicked to the next slide, interest payments versus federal expenditures. The chart showed a red line that had crossed every major spending category. Interest on the national debt now consumed $1.2 trillion annually, more than defense spending, more than Medicare, more than Social Security. It was, Powell explained, the largest single expense of the federal government. "We're no longer borrowing to invest in America's future," Powell continued, his voice growing more somber with each word. "We're borrowing to pay interest on money we've already borrowed. This is the definition of a debt spiral, and mathematically it can only end one way." But Ray's attention was caught by something else on the chart, a projection line that extended into 2027 and beyond. The trajectory was exponential. By 2030, interest payments alone would consume nearly 40% of all federal tax revenue. The implications were staggering. Yellen cleared her throat. "Ray, we've brought you here because Bridgewater's models have been the most accurate at predicting these cycles. We need to know, in your professional opinion, how much time do we have?" Ray studied the data for several long minutes, his mind processing the variables with the precision that had made him one of the world's most successful investors. But this wasn't about making money anymore. This was about the survival of the economic system that had defined his entire career. Based on these numbers, Ray finally said, "Assuming current spending patterns and interest rate trajectories, you have 18 months, maybe less." The room fell silent. Someone's pen dropped onto the table, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the tense atmosphere. 18 months until what, exactly?" asked a voice Ray didn't recognize, some senior Treasury official whose security clearance apparently exceeded his own. Ray looked directly at Powell. "Until you face the trilemma that has destroyed every reserve currency in history. You can maintain the dollar's value, or you can finance government operations, or you can service the national debt, but you cannot do all three simultaneously. Something has to break." Powell nodded grimly. "Show him the international data." The next series of slides revealed the scope of what Ray was beginning to understand was a coordinated global shift away from dollar dependence. China had reduced their treasury holdings by 15% in the past 6 months alone. Russia had eliminated dollars from their sovereign wealth fund entirely. Even traditional allies like Germany and Japan were quietly diversifying their reserves into gold, euros, and other currencies. "The world is losing confidence in our ability to manage our fiscal situation," Yellen explained. "And when that confidence breaks completely, She didn't need to finish the sentence. Ray understood the implications better than anyone in the room. When global confidence in the dollar collapsed, the United States would lose what economists called the exorbitant privilege, the ability to print money and have the world accept it as payment for real goods and services. But then Powell revealed the truly terrifying part. Ray, there's something else, something we discovered 3 days ago that changes everything. Powell's hands were visibly shaking now as he pulled up a classified intelligence report. We believe several major economies are coordinating their dollar exit strategy. This isn't happening by accident. The document showed communication intercepts between central banks in Beijing, Moscow, and surprisingly, several European capitals. The conversations outlined a systematic plan to reduce dollar dependency while simultaneously preparing alternative systems for international trade. Ray's mind flashed to his own principles about how debt cycles end. Throughout history, when dominant powers became over-leveraged, their rivals didn't just wait for collapse, they actively accelerated it. Rome had faced the same coordinated pressure from Germanic tribes. Britain had faced it from rising American economic power. How many people know about this? Ray asked. Including you. 12, Powell replied. And that number needs to stay exactly where it is. Ray understood why. If this information became public, it would trigger the very crisis they were trying to prevent. Markets would panic. International investors would flee. Dollar-denominated assets en masse. The resulting collapse would make 2008 look like a minor correction. But as Ray studied the data more carefully, he realized something that chilled him even more than the debt figures. The timing of the coordinated international pressure wasn't random. These countries were positioning for a post-dollar world because they believed, based on America's own fiscal data, that the collapse was inevitable anyway. You haven't told me the worst part yet, have you? Ray said quietly. Powell and Yellen exchanged a look that confirmed Ray's suspicion. The domestic political situation makes meaningful debt reduction impossible, Yellen admitted. Congress won't cut spending significantly. They won't raise taxes substantially, and they certainly won't default explicitly. That leaves only one option. Ray nodded. He'd seen this movie before in other countries. Monetary inflation. You'll be forced to print money to service the debt, which will devalue the currency, which will make the debt crisis worse, which will require more money printing. It's a death spiral, Powell confirmed. And once it starts, we lose control of the timeline. Powell cleared his throat. Ray, we need your help with something unprecedented. We need you to prepare contingency models for what happens to American financial markets during a managed decline of dollar hegemony. The room fell silent again as the full weight of America's fiscal reality settled over them. Ray found himself thinking about his own family, his investors, the millions of Americans who had built their retirement plans around the assumption that the dollar would remain stable and dominant. The phrase managed decline hit Ray like a physical blow. These weren't hypothetical scenarios anymore. The Federal Reserve was actively planning for the end of the dollar's reign as the world's primary reserve currency. Ray spent the next 2 hours reviewing classified data that painted a picture of American financial vulnerability unlike anything he'd seen in his 50-year career. The debt service costs were accelerating faster than economic growth. International confidence was eroding systematically, and domestic political gridlock made meaningful reform impossible. We're asking you to help us find a way to preserve as much American wealth as possible during an inevitable transition, Yellen corrected, because the alternative, an uncontrolled collapse, would be catastrophic, not just for us, but for the entire global economy. You're asking me to model the controlled demolition of the American financial empire, Ray said slowly. Ray stared at the message, understanding immediately what was being offered. China wasn't just preparing for the end of dollar dominance, they were offering select Americans the chance to profit from it. The most sophisticated economic warfare in history, and they were recruiting Ray to switch sides. As Ray walked to his car in the underground parking garage, his secure phone buzzed with an encrypted message. The sender was listed only as Beijing Financial Ministry. Ray's hands trembled as he read the brief text. Mr. Dalio, we understand you've had an enlightening evening. Perhaps it's time we discuss post-dollar transition opportunities. A jet is waiting at Reagan National. The future of global finance is being written without American participation, unless wise Americans choose to participate. By the time the meeting ended at 11:47 p.m., Ray understood that he had just witnessed the death throes of the Bretton Woods system that had dominated global finance since 1944. The dollar's reign as the world's reserve currency wasn't ending gradually. It was ending rapidly, and the timeline was measured in months, not years. He looked back at the Federal Reserve Building, where Powell and Yellen were presumably still trying to figure out how to manage an impossible situation with no good options. Then he looked at his phone, where China was offering him a lifeboat off a sinking ship. The encrypted phone buzzed again, with a new message. The jet departs in 2 hours. After that, the invitation expires. Choose wisely, Mr. Dalio. History will remember who stood on the right side of this transition. For the first time in his career, Ray Dalio faced a choice that wasn't about markets or profits or economic principles. It was about loyalty, survival, and whether the American financial empire deserved to be saved, or whether its debt-fueled collapse was simply the inevitable consequence of decades of fiscal irresponsibility. The American dream wasn't just ending. It was being systematically dismantled by creditors who had finally lost patience with promises that could never be kept. And Ray Dalio, one of America's most successful investors, now had to choose between his country and his survival. Ray's breath formed clouds in the cold Washington air as he realized that tonight hadn't just been a briefing about America's debt crisis. It had been his recruitment into the final phase of a global power transition that would reshape the international order for the next century. As he walked toward his car, Ray's phone displayed a new alert. Overnight trading showed the dollar falling against every major currency, gold spiking to new all-time highs, and treasury yields jumping as international investors began what looked like the beginning of a coordinated exit from dollar-denominated assets.